Hello, welcome to Confused Iraqi. I'm Alana Travers.
And this is Noor.
In this episode, we'll be picking things up in 2012 and looking through to 2017 or just before 2017. And this is the period people may most associate with the rise of ISIS in Iraq. For me, particularly, this is probably the time period that I both know least about, but also began to read more and more about in Western media. And I'm really curious to hear from Noor about her account of this time.
Yes, so I picked this period because I think it's life-changing period in my life, because this is when I was realizing what is happening around.
And you said in 2012 that was the year that you felt most exposed to the faults in the Iraqi state. And I'm wondering how far that's linked to volunteering kind of commitments, or what sort of faults you noticed and how that made you feel, and you're kind of coming of age in a country that isn't quite working.
I was studying to become a teacher at that time, and then so obviously I will end up in an education system in Iraq. And during that time, I've already recognized that I don't think I want to work in that system. I didn't believe that the system was strong enough. Still, a few years after the war, it's still a very weak system. Mm-hmm. So going to the States changed something in me. It made me realize that I could play bigger roles. I could maybe be part of change. So I started doing lots of volunteering, engaging with different people, trying to help. Maybe not feel myself as someone who would have this simple life, but could actually do something. So in 2013, I was in my third year in university, and I was very busy with volunteering, more than anything else, doing lots of volunteering, which helped me a lot when 2014 happened.
So June 2014 was when ISIS took Mosul, which was at the time the second largest city in Iraq. It was a pretty historic moment. Obviously got so much news coverage around the world, and I'm just wondering, how that felt to be in Iraq at the time, how it was covered.
Yeah, just also a bit of background to that. Because of the situation of the country was unstable, Iraqis didn't really travel to other governorates, so we didn't really meet people from different backgrounds. You know Iraq, how diverse it is. Sunni, Shia, Arab, Kurds, different religion groups, different ethnicities. But we didn't engage my generation, especially like my father's generation. They meet each other at that time, military, different schools. But thankfully, before this whole thing happens with ISIS, the country was going through a time where people could meet each other a bit. So through exchange programs internally in Iraq, and through the one I went to the state, I was able to meet people from Mosul, from the governorates that were impacted by the ISIS taking of the area.
And of course, we should say, not just in Mosul, but vast swathes of Iraq, including Ramadi and the whole of Anbar and
Anbar, Salahuddin, Diyala, Kirkuk, parts of Kurdistan also.
Yeah, and this was happening throughout, from 2011 onwards, essentially.
Yeah.
So this was the undercurrent to this period.
Yes, the country wasn't stable, and then there were government decisions that people weren't happy with. So protests was already taking place in Sunni governorates, especially in Anbar, among tribes, and tribes are influential in Iraq. But they were their demands were a bit ignored, we can say that. So ISIS saw opportunity in that. It took years for them, actually years of protesting, but nothing happened. The change they asked for didn't happen. So ISIS took the opportunity, and they took over Mosul over a sudden. All I remember is waking up, and news says there is ISIS in Mosul. We know that ISIS is in Syria. How did they make it into here? Can they take Mosul? Mosul is the second biggest city in Iraq after Baghdad. It's a massive city. How can ISIS with a few cars come and take a city?
Yeah,
we were shocked.
700 trucks or something. Oh, it was fewer than that.
Fewer than that. And how did that happen? We had military bases there. We have security actors. We were shocked. Couldn't believe it. All I was thinking about at that time, my friends there. I want to check on them. How are they? And I was able to communicate to some of them. Obviously, they were going through a lot, so it wasn't easy to reach them. It took days to be able to get a response from some of them and being worried about them. And I remember at that time, I had a friend who was studying to become a doctor. And he was saying that his family decided to stay to know what is going to happen. And then a few days after, he said, no, actually, my family will leave, but I will stay home to protect the house. And I was thinking, why would a guy studying to become a doctor, who's already very ambitious, and very active, want to stay to protect a house within an area that is taken by ISIS. So my advice to him was like, you are a good person and you shouldn't waste your life and the contribution that you can give later on to protect the house, and try to trust what they can bring to the area. So he eventually was able to leave, and it was very difficult for him.
Well, actually, yeah, we should add it was incredibly hard, right? People
Very
had to
difficult.
smuggle themselves out in many cases, and if you were caught, you're dead. So it wasn't like people couldn't leave.
No internet, no
Or
SIM
could leave,
cards,
rather.
yeah. And especially for men, and you get questioned, and then you never know what happens to you. And that it was at the beginnings, so you also have to understand that they were trying to take as much as they can. And then at that time, they released a record saying that we took Mosul, we took these areas, we are going after Najaf and Karbala.
Wow.
Many people in Najaf flew to Iran. People were scared, and like, can they reached north of Baghdad also. It was very rapid expansion, and it's like we couldn't believe it. And Syria was already happening next door. We were very concerned that the same thing would happen for Iraq. Thankfully, people, the country, the governments, religious leaders, global coalitions were formed to fight ISIS in Iraq. It took years for that to be accomplished. But yeah, it was, I would say, intense time in Iraq. But I was able to realize what happens and be able to monitor the news. During that time, I was still in Najaf in 2014. And we had lots of displaced people leaving their areas, especially Shia areas, were coming to Najaf. ISIS did something, which is giving an option to Christians to convert or give money, giving Sunnis an option also to show their alliances or leave. And for Shia, they didn't have an option. They were to be killed. So they all, obviously, many of them, and Yazidis, exactly. So the Yazidis and Shia weren't given an option. So many Shia came to Najaf, and at that time, I was, as I said, I was already engaged in lots of volunteering. So we went to the street to see these people and ask them what they want. We were shocked. Najaf is centered around a grave, the Imam Ali grave, the Golden Grave, and many people come from around the world to visit it. So IDPs did the same. Displaced people also went there because people could notice them and could help them. We went there and we were asking families what do they need, and they were like, we don't have anything. You can give us whatever.
And where were these families from?
They were Turkomanis. And Turkomanis is not Kurds or Arabs. They are a specific group, and many of them are Shia. And they are in different parts of Nineveh and Kirkuk also. Many of them were actually from Tal Afar, the ones who came to Najaf. There were Sunnis also from Anbar. There were Christians who came to Najaf. And I remember a funny story, but unfortunate. I remember interacting with females, asking them, what do you need? Yeah. Many of them were mothers. They definitely wanted food for their children. But they were saying, we want the abaya. Abaya is what females wear, like the official Iraqi way of dressing Islamically. It was interesting because that's where they wanted to fit in. They didn't want to look like they are different. Of
course, because that's quite specific to
and then you can easily spot them. So they wanted the abayas, and we were trying to help these people. During that time, I got a job with the United Nations. I just got graduated. I worked as a United Nations volunteer. Thankfully, my focus was on social cohesion and inclusion of these people in the community. Because it's been already almost a year that they moved to Najaf, and people weren't sure when they are going to return. So there were projects around how do we support these people. I remember one of the projects that I after consulting the community, you ask them, what do you want? And many of them were saying, our children are unable to play and learn with other children, the children from this community. So because they cannot speak Arabic, they speak their own language. And then they are not doing well in school because, again, it's different language. And it was different case for boys and girls. Boys were able to learn Arabic faster, quicker, because they were able to go up in the street and play soccer, football with other boys. While girls, they just stay home. And the project was basically trying to bring children from the host community and the IDPs together, playing football, doing some DIYs in order to exchange language. It was a very simple thing, but I would say it shows how in Iraq diversity is a big thing, and it create vulnerabilities to people. Language was in this case preventing children from their education, being able to achieve in it, and being able to interact with the community.
Can I interject very quickly and just say I want to ask more questions about ISIS. I appreciate this isn't necessarily the point of this podcast. I want to highlight 2 books that listeners might want to track down. There's one by an academic called Fawaz Gage, which is called ISIS, A History, and another one called The Rise of ISIS by a man called Patrick Coburn. I think I recommended a book of his in the last podcast. And these are really great overviews of kind of what happened, the displacement that happened, but also these big battles that were fought, obviously the horrific crimes that ISIS were sort of causing and doing in this time, and also again to sort of bring it back to the narrative. During this time, you were volunteering in Najaf, 2015, around that time. It's what's interesting to me, just listening, is how little of this that we knew in the West. That there was nothing on the social, upheaval in Iraq or the displacement. It might have got like 1 or 2 lines in the news report. We were reading or watching rather the headings, the fight in Mosul. I remember, I think probably my first conversation about ISIS. I started university in 2015. It's my first year, and I think my very first conversation with some of my guys in my corridor was about the Paris attacks or the Bataclan attack. I think that was that year. We were always seeing it through the lens of the Western attacks, and I just wanted to make that point, and I think it's really important, the side that you're saying. And it makes me just want to ask the question, were you guys having conversations about ISIS, or were you kind of just blocking it out? Like what, I'm curious, I assume you spoke about it, that you never quite know.
No, this is a very good question, because I think the easy answer to give to that is ISIS was all Iraqis' problem, not only the areas that they were active in. Because there were families that recruited their sons and were worried about them the whole time. Because ISIS brought Iraqis together in somehow, in a way that they were sharing the same struggle, sharing the same purpose to defeat that enemy in country. Everybody had something to give or actually lost to that conflict. So I would say we weren't discussing what is happening with people who were directly impacted. It was an exchange. You are impacted this way, we are impacted this way, this is how you're contributing, this is how we are contributing, how can we just figure this out together? And I think Iraqis didn't really focus. Some people took a racist approach into it, saying that this is the Sunni problems and like Shias are defending the country for them. But in general, the general situation, I would say, it was like, this is the Iraq problem that we need to figure it out together. And the news were disturbing. Many Iraqis had people in these governorates, and it wasn't like these are only Sunni areas, only Sunnis were impacted.
Of course. Well, I wanted to say, you moved to Erbil in 2016. We're both in Erbil now. It's a city we know well. And I know personal stories of several friends who moved here during the ISIS war, either from Mosul, mostly from Mosul, or Western Iraq, where they faced hostilities here. The Kurdistan region was a very safe haven for IDPs, and it remains still.
I would say it was a very difficult time to Kurdistan. Again, as Iraqis in the south were fighting and Sunnis were living the conflict. For Kurdistan, they already had, for years prior to that, received Syrian refugees and host Syrian refugees.
And they still do.
Yeah, instead they still do. So there was already a huge wave of newcomers that Kurdistan had to deal with.
Yeah.
And then now Iraqis from these impacted areas are also going to Kurdistan. My friend, the person who I asked to leave, and thankfully he did it, he eventually also went to Kurdistan. Many people went to Kurdistan. But why did I make the decision to go to Kurdistan? Working in Najaf, trying to support these families, I figured it wasn't enough. Conflict was still going and there's so much support needed. And I wanted to be as close as possible to Mosul. I grew up hearing stories of Mosul. I never been there because my father was based in Mosul when he was in the military, and he had these great stories from the time he was there with his friends. So I went to the kitchen. I told my family, it's like I applied without you knowing for the last few months. I was applying for jobs to go to Erbil, and I got one. Can I go? And my mother said, no way. My father said, yes, definitely. So I came, and my father won the argument. He was like, you are going there to support people. I care about people in Mosul. Go there. I came here completely alone.
And you were 22 or
22 at that time. Alone, didn't know much about the place. I came here, I started working with an NGO, and thankfully they had a response on Mosul and on Syrian refugees, on Yazidi community, on people from Mosul. So I was able to interact with people who just recently left the conflict. So many people who came to Najaf didn't even interact with ISIS. They just heard something is happening. Yeah. They already took the center, so they left.
And then suddenly you're interacting with people who lived under ISIS.
Yes. Shocking stories. Couldn't believe. You know, sometimes when you are over shocked that you smile because that's the only reaction that
Quite
you can do.
All the time.
Yes. And I was always, even now remembering, I just can only smile, which is like control yourself in these situations because I just can't believe. It's very impossible to believe these stories. But from that time, meeting people, I just want to end with a story of a child that was impacted by this conflict that I met. And I think it's a story worth telling. We went to a food distribution location in Shirkat. Shirkat was recently liberated at that time. And I saw children playing football, and there was this child just watching them from outside the fence. Not really interested, but at the same time he was a child and looked a bit mature, to be honest. He was only 9 probably. And I went to speak to the children, and he looked at me and he was like, you're happy to bring us some oil and rice and flour. You don't know what these children, what these people went through a week ago because the liberation just happened. I was like, can you tell me? And then this very sad person started talking. You can tell he's sad. He's seen a lot. He's like, can you see that guy? He started pointing at the children playing football. Like, can you see that boy? He had to witness his brother killing his father because ISIS forced him because his father was in the military. This other boy, he saw his father taken from the house and killed in the middle of the street. And he started pointing at the children and telling stories. I don't remember his story because probably he didn't tell me his story. But I still remember how I felt very small in front of him and how these people seen so much that we would never, any day in our life, be able to understand. This is their own struggle, their own stories, their own loss, that we can only ask them to tell us, to hear it.
And so that was after the liberation of Baffles area, and of course it took another year for the liberation of Mosul, after the Battle of Mosul in 2017. And I suppose I'd like to end this podcast, Noor, by just asking for your broader reflections on the impact of this. Yet again, another conflict. We could talk more in depth about how it was connected to the previous conflict and faults within the governments of Iraq in that period. But what are your takeaways from how people lived?
For me, to be honest, the thing to take is we need to think of the impact of such tragedies on children. We started this podcast with stories from my childhood, and me now being 30 years old, still reflecting on them. You also were remembering days from your childhood. We need to think about the actions and the conflicts that are taking place around us and how they impact children. And actually, meeting Dhafar that day, still thinking about him, remembering his name, I made a realization that day. During that time, many Iraqis were trying to leave the country. After that conversation, I've decided I shouldn't leave Iraq. There is so much to do here, and I'm accountable as an Iraqi to try to do as much as I can for these children at least.
And if we look back on this period, what are the points of particular confusion for you, or things that you realised which were surprising and make you reflect slightly differently on your experience?
I think something very surprising to me was all the time I was in the State, I wanted to return home, and I grew much more love to my country when I was there. I was a bit confused, obviously, that this is happening. Like I was from a country that is experiencing deprivation, war, conflict, instability, and now I was in the state, and all I was thinking about is like, no, I don't want to be there. I want to go back to Iraq. That's very interesting. And that, of course, the biggest confusion moment I would say during that whole time is how can ISIS happen in a country that is heavily militarized? We invest so much in security. Many of Iraqi men are already in the military. We already have security actors from different countries in the country.
Yeah.
How can that happen?
Yeah.